This is a brief overview of instructional design for teachers. There are 5 basic steps that you want to consider when you're planning instruction. You analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate the instruction. Analysis begins when you try to outline the parameters you have, like how much time, what resources are available, the traits of the kids that you're going to be teaching. Experienced teachers nail this one. That's why they're so successful. They can accurately predict how the kids are going to respond to the instruction, how much it's going to cost to do this lesson, and any restrictions that you may need to consider. Okay, what is key when you design the instruction? Well, there are different elements that come into play when you are designing, and some teachers start in one place, some start in another to form their instructional plan. Most people start with their objective, but these are all the different elements that come into play when you are designing your instruction. And no one is more important than the other. It's just important that you consider each one before you quit your design. Okay, so we'll look at each of these individually. Since most teachers start with the objective, we'll consider that one. It's just a clear statement about what you want your students to do as a result of your instruction. Hammer the verb. The verb has to be right. And you might have 200 objectives in a whole year. Goals, you may have only 3 or 4. Goals are broad. They are often not measurable. Objectives are always targeted and measurable. Okay. There are 3 kinds of objectives: personal, social, or content. So if they deal with the individual student, they're personal. With the group setting, they're social. And with some content, of course, they're content related. And 3 types of each of these: knowledge, skills, or values that you can teach. You want to make sure your objectives are relevant to the student. They have to understand what it has to do with them, or they're less likely to learn. A duck doesn't care about a Corvette, so it's not going to be very receptive to information about a Corvette. So just make sure the students understand why they're learning what they're learning. Now, for personal objectives, here's an example for each different type: knowledge, skill, or value of a personal objective, social, and content related. Never use the verbs know, learn, or understand in your objective. These are cognitive functions that are hidden. You have to infer that they exist because of the actions the students do. Therefore, just use the actions. So if you want the student to learn the causes of the Civil War, the student should describe the causes of the Civil War. And so just use describe rather than learn. So never use these 3 verbs. Pre-assessment will help you not try to teach students things they already know. So make sure you include a pre-assessment. Usually it's just the form of a few quick verbal questions to see if your students know what it is you're going to be teaching. You can differentiate content, what it is you're teaching. You can differentiate the process, the way you teach it, or the way the students learn it, either of those. And you can differentiate the product, what it is you want students to produce to show that they've learned. So differentiation can occur in any part of your lesson, really. Now it's time to develop your lesson. So you make sure that you obtain the resources that you'll need, and consider the physical space. You may have to alter it, and you want to make sure that you develop with time constraints clearly in mind. Know how much time you have to work with. All right, now it's time to implement the instruction, and the biggest decision a teacher is going to make is what role to put the student. Okay, now young teachers, new teachers tend to default to passive students, with the teacher working real hard and the students sitting and listening. That's not necessarily where great learning occurs. You also want to consider your role. You are not necessarily the one who is doing all the talking and the source of all knowledge. You don't have to do that. Experienced teachers tend to try to put students in an active role and let them decide what needs to happen. Much richer learning occurs there than if you put the students in a passive role where you're telling them everything to do. So it takes experience, but I want to encourage you to go ahead and consider putting students in charge of the learning and even your role. Let them define what it is that you're doing. You have to give up control to do that. It's a little scary, but it works for a lot of experienced teachers. Certainly, you want to get more than one strategy. As many strategies as you can practice while you're here at Roanoke College, you'll want to go ahead and practice those. It's a poor teacher that has but one, so all these are types of different strategies, and there are many more. Physical environment is under your control. You decide where desks are and if the lights are on or off, or if music is playing, or if you're outside. All that's you, so you want to consider that when you're implementing instruction. Also, learning consists of disparate facts unless you design and implement activities that help the students meld those facts into a much larger concept. So you want to make sure that you give your students ways to process that information so that those concepts are formed. Evaluations where you learn if your students can actually do what you wanted them to be able to do. This is a picture of an evaluation, and the student can't hit the target. They are not able to do what you wanted them to do. So just make sure when you are developing assessments for your students, the practice you give your students should very closely match the test that you give them. Okay, there shouldn't be any surprises for students. I know you are often surprised about your assessments here in college, but actually you don't want to do that to children. Make sure that you have had them practice the stuff you want them to be responsible for. Valid tests match objectives, so they should also, there should be a almost one-to-one pairing between objectives and assessment items. They should look very similar. And then avoid threats to validity and reliability by making sure that students are doing what you taught them to do on tests. Give them questions that are representative of those objectives. Make sure they're testing where they were taught. Environment's very important for children, and try to avoid external distractions. Give them enough time to do what it is you ask. So that's a summary of the design process or developing instruction. Analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate your instruction. And then rinse and repeat simply means you're going to revisit these steps with your instruction to make it better and better.